We all know that the State of Israel was established as a national home for the Jewish people. Israel's famous law of return guarantees that all Jews have the right to live in Israel. That means that we and our co-religionists around the world are all potential Israeli citizens. Indeed, the country's nation-state law explicitly states that Israel is the state of the Jewish people. And whether we actually move to Israel or not, there's no doubt that decisions taken in Israel can and do impact us directly. Yet our lives are radically different from those of our Israeli brothers and sisters in ways we all understand. The question we'll try to answer together today is, given all of that, should global Jewry have a say in how the Jewish state is run, a country in which they may not live, but in which they have deep emotional investment and potential citizenship? There's been an interesting development since we started preparing for this session. As we began our preparation efforts and started talking with others about the topic, we found that many others were already speaking and thinking about it as well, including our speakers on this panel. Just 3 days ago, Israel's Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Omer Yankelovich, announced that she will be presenting a government bill to the Knesset that will require Israeli government ministries to take diaspora Jewry into account when crafting new decisions and legislation. Such a law, if passed, would potentially be one of the most significant events in Israeli diaspora relations in decades. And we're very proud of the role that today's session had in these developments. We'll see where that effort takes us. I'm now honored to begin this session with a brief opening from Israel's Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Omer Yankelovich, and I'd like to welcome her to our meeting.
If my last 6 months as Minister of Diaspora Affairs have taught me anything, it's that world Jewry does have a voice. It's rich, it's diverse, it's powerful, and most importantly, it cannot and should not be ignored. Esteemed colleagues and friends, it is critical that the Israeli society and the Israeli government listen to all these voices. We must deeply understand the interests and needs of Israel's 8 million brothers and sisters living outside our borders. This is especially true when the state of Israel makes decisions that directly impact Jewish communities outside of Israel regarding Jewish education, engagement, and resilience. We, at the Diaspora Affairs Ministry, carry this important mandate. We see ourselves as the natural address for the convening all of the voices of world Jewry and bring them to the government of Israel. I look forward to working in direct partnership with my colleagues, Mr. Fingerhut, and the Jewish Federations Network and the Jewish Agency as we move this panel's questions into a place of action. Be'atzlacha, v'toda rabba.
Thank you very much, Minister Yankelovich. And now I'd like to invite JFNA's President and CEO, Eric Fingerhut, to help set the stage for us. As a former member of Congress, Eric has fairly good insights into government policy, which will add a lot to today's discussion. After Eric speaks, we'll hear short remarks from 3 current members of Knesset. So let's begin with Eric Fingerhut. What do you think about all this? Should North American Jews have the right to influence what goes on in Israel? And frankly, is this any of our business?
Well, David, thank you. It's great to be here. It's wonderful to kick off this virtual GA 2020 with this very important panel. Thanks to Minister Yankelovich and thanks to the members of Knesset who we're going to hear from in a moment. I want to first by just lay down the premise, which is I think there's no question that we are committed to each other. Israel to the diaspora and diaspora to Israel. Members of Knesset can correct me if they think I'm wrong, but I don't think there's a single government of Israel, no matter what its makeup, that if they saw Jews in distress around the world, wouldn't move to try to save Jews. And that there's no question that the Israeli public would support that. And I want to say that I think that equally true of the diaspora. We are committed to the existence, the flourishing of the state of Israel. One small example, I would, for folks who don't know this, there's not many criteria for Jewish federations to belong to the Jewish Federations of North America network. But one is that they must commit that a portion of their allocations, their support that they raise every year, goes to causes that they care about in Israel and around the world. Of course, our long historic partners, the Jewish Agency and the Joint and ORT, are the primary recipients of those funds. So we're already deeply committed to each other. I also think it's important for us to remember that this is not about the fact that there's one set of opinions in Israel and another set of opinions in the diaspora. We have diverse opinions. The truth is we disagree amongst each other within the diaspora as much as Jews in Israel do as well. So this is not about presenting a monolithic opinion, but rather about having, as the minister said, all voices heard. So with that in mind, how do I approach this question, David, both as the head of JFNA and also with my former political hat on, public policy as a member of Congress and the state legislature? So I actually start with my Jewish hat on and say, remember that Hillel the elder, the great sage of the Talmud, said, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to others." So I start by asking myself the question, how do we feel about Israelis' influence and trying to weigh in on our decisions in the diaspora? And now let's take this GA, for example. Do we want Israelis to weigh in on the issues that face our community? Of course we do. In fact, it's almost unthinkable that we would have a GA that didn't have prominent Israeli voices adding to our own self-examination and our own self-response. And in general, do we welcome Israeli opinions and insights into issues that affect North American Jews? And I think the answer to that is also yes. We certainly welcome their opinions on U.S.-Israel relations. What policy steps is our country taking? How does it impact Israel? We welcome their input on security, both domestic and global security, on issues of Jewish identity, even when we disagree with the opinions, or the input. I think we welcome it, and we want to hear it, and we need to hear it. I'm going to touch the third rail. Even something as controversial as elections, right? It is not inappropriate, and I don't feel that it's inappropriate anyway when an Israeli shares with me their perspective on Israeli elections, and certainly I've shared my opinion sometimes with Israelis about their elections. But of course, they don't get a vote in our elections, and we don't get a vote in theirs. And to be honest, in between those extremes, where we want to have conversation and dialogue, we don't want to have. We don't give away a right to vote or direct influence. Be honest, between those extremes, there are lines of propriety that shouldn't be crossed. And so I'll say with my friends from the Knesset on the call, our backs would go up, rightly so. I think if you did more than express views about an election, but actually tried to tell us how to vote, just as our backs would go up if Israelis tried to tell us how to organize our synagogues or our other religious institutions, or how to organize our communities. So what's my lesson from that is, I according to Hillel, I want to respect the things that would bother me. I want to respect in reverse. I believe Israelis and the government should want to hear from us, to learn and understand our perspectives, and to hear our views. But we shouldn't tell the Israeli government what to do, certainly not threaten to withhold support if they don't agree with us, and we sure don't get a vote in these matters. And I do take that to be the spirit of the proposals that Minister Yankelevich has put forward, as well as the spirit of the work of the Diaspora Committee of the Knesset, which we so value as an initiative of the members of the Knesset today. Secondly, I want to say that I hope Israelis see that their institutions and their ability to lead benefits from inclusiveness and a tone of welcomeness. I want to just cite one example, the Office of the Presidency. We understand that the Knesset is made up of factions. That's how parliaments work. But the Constitution, Israel's basic law, created this Office of the Presidency that represents us all. And from Chaim Weizmann to Chaim Herzog to Shimon Peres to President Rivlin today, people of very different political persuasions. They have embodied this inclusiveness and welcomeness. And I urge that Israelis think long and hard about that and continue that tradition. And finally, and with this I'll end, David, I think we should all pay attention to supporting the institutions that are non-governmental institutions, but do put us in a shared governance role, whether it's the Jewish Agency that we partnered with the World Zionist Organization in, and Keren HaYesod, the global table that the Jewish Agency has put together, and initiatives. There's lots of initiatives out there trying to create this common perspective, our common destiny, a project of President Rivlin and the Genesis Philanthropy and others. So we should support these types of institutions, bringing the shlichim here and into our camps and our campuses and all. So I think if we can, and with this, I'm so anxious to hear from our members of Knesset, if we can model the love of the Jewish people, lev el lev, heart to heart, if we can model civility, elu ve'elu, realizing that we have different opinions, but these are all legitimate opinions, and we model Jewish unity, if we can be the leaders, then I think this very important conversation about how we dialogue together about Israel and Israelis dialogue together about the diaspora with us will be a positive one.
Thank you very much, Eric. Today, the Knesset has 33 female members, comprising approximately 28% of Israel's parliament. And we're very proud to welcome 3 of those members of Knesset who have joined us today. Our first MK is a relatively new parliamentarian. Member of Knesset Tehila Friedman was elected this year and represents the Blue and White Party in the Knesset. Her first Knesset speech was so moving and powerful that it has been viewed more than 10,000 times. But MK Friedman has another outstanding credential worth noting. She actually once served as the Israel representative of the Federation of Greater Metro West. So she really is one of us. Member of Knesset Friedman, we look forward to hearing your opening thoughts on this subject. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, I must say it's not my first GA, and I do feel at home. I worked for 6 years for the Jewish Federation of New Jersey. It was Central New Jersey, then they merged, and it's Metro West. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. And this is also why one of the first law bills that I proposed, as I'm not sure about the terms, I need your help with that, but in Israel we have, as a member of Knesset, you can submit a personal law proposal, and the government can submit a governmental bill. It's different status. And what happened is that I came with this proposal of making consultation mandatory. And I was thrilled, and I must say still surprised that last week, Ministry of Diaspora Affairs announced they're going to adopt it and make it governmental one. And this is a huge step forward because the chances for that to pass now are great, are greater. There's way to go. Now, I want to explain something about this proposal. I think it's obvious for all of us that there are issues that only citizens can decide on and even can have a voice on. And when it comes to security, when it comes to questions of internal economy. It's obvious that, only if you live in a place and only if you pay the price for the decision, you're allowed to have a voice. But I hope it's also obvious that when Israel is making a decision that have a direct impact on the entire Jewish people, such as how the Kotel should look like, questions of conversion. I can give another example. Only months ago, there was a discussion about changing law of return and changing the status of a grandchildren when only the grandparents is Jewish. So changing this status, there was a discussion about that. So part of the Knesset members thought it's about our immigration law, but it's not only about our immigration law. It has a direct impact on Jewish communities worldwide. So when it comes to those issues, I think diaspora Jewry should have a voice. Now, what's the right mechanism for that? That's a good question, because diaspora Jewry is based on it's based on a voluntary joining. And, who's representing who? It's a good question. So I propose some mechanism that involve Jaffe together with Ministry for Diaspora Affairs, and they together need to, decide. And sometimes it's going to be ad hoc, and sometimes it's going to be same people. And I'm not saying my proposal is the perfect one. There's a lot of work to do on it. But I think what was important to me is to put on the table this idea of having a voice. As a woman, I know that so many years, Jewish women, were an object for decisions that others made, and they were not part of the discussion. Halachic decision were made only by men, and we were subject for them, but we were not part of the discussion. And I know how better is a word when we are part of the discussion. Now, it doesn't mean that the Israel government should always agree. It only means they should always listen. Now, I remember the days of the conversion bill. And I remember JFNA, Jerry Silverman back then, going back and forth to different governmental ministries, and sometimes, was welcomed. And sometimes I felt he needed to beg for his voice to be heard. And I want to avoid this begging. I want to make it mandatory, make it a duty to consult with, to hear the voice. Now, I know it's controversial. I'm getting the pushbacks from the right and the left, from different perspectives. From the left, people who are worried, and I respect it. I fully respect the word that when we give a place and a voice for diaspora Jewry, something in the balance between the Jewish and the democratic character of Israel, the balance is not balanced enough, let's say. The Jewish part is getting heavier, the gravita of it getting bigger. And that's a danger for the democratic character of Israel. From the right, I'm getting questions such as, if someone want to have a voice here, so they can make aliyah, they're always welcome. But if you are not a citizen, why should you have a voice? Now, I know that in other countries, we're not the only country that has diaspora. We were one of the first one, we together with the Greek and the Armenians, but we're not the only. And in France, for example, people who live in diaspora vote for Parliament and Senate. So there are other, countries that want to take in account and hear and give a much bigger place to the diasporas. And I think that what I'm proposing is balanced. I wouldn't give the right to vote. I think that's to go way too far. And yet I think I think it's part of for me, it's part of my Zionist identity. I believe in Israel as a national home state for the Jewish people, not the Israeli people. There is no Israeli people, there are Jewish people. And I think that's only a fulfillment of this mission of Israel, to be the homeland of us all. So I think that's it for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next speaker is member of Knesset Merav Michaeli. MK Michaeli is a former journalist who was first elected to Israel's parliament in 2012. She hasn't joined her fellow members of the Labor Party in the current coalition government in Israel and has chosen to remain in opposition. Member of Knesset Michaeli, do you see things the same way as MK Friedman? Should diaspora Jews have more of a say and more of an involvement in decisions that are made with respect to certain aspects of life in Israel?
Thank you, David, and good evening. Thank you for having me. I want to, state that I'm not sure that I was on this forum per se, but I want to state that I started my acquaintance with the American Jewish community in '83 when I was in the Scouts delegation and was a counselor in a JCC day camp in West Palm Beach, Florida for 2.5 months. So, I take pride in this chapter of my relationship with the community. First of all, I want to return in maybe some questions. I think that when we are asking, should diaspora Jews have a say, then who exactly, if we continue things that were heard here before, who exactly is the representative that is sort of authorized to convey whatever positions of whom exactly in the diaspora as part of the discussion. So that's one thing we need to consider. Another thing that we need to consider is that that there are certain diaspora Jews who have a major say in internal and domestic issues of Israel by putting in a lot of money. We see a lot of these on the right side of the political map and less, but still not none, on the left side of the political map. There are individuals and groups, one needs to admit, that have an overwhelming effect on the way Israel is going and the decisions that are being made and the political map, the way it's being shaped by putting their weight, which mostly means money. So again, we go back to the question of who exactly are we considering as being engaged or having a say in Israeli domestic life. And thirdly, I want to say that this whole question would never have come up if Israel had not betrayed its initial obligation to be the home of the Jewish people. And the way Israel has neglected its obligation to being a democratic state. Yes, the state of the Jewish people, but the homeland of all the Jewish people. And the reason why we have to even ask this question tonight is because for too long, Israel is the only place on earth where not all Jews are treated equally. And the only place in the world that does not recognize all kinds of Jews the same way is what is supposed to be the homeland of the Jewish people. This is something that Israel needs to correct sooner than later, not only because of diaspora Jews, But first, because we also have non-Orthodox or non-secular Jews or non-Jews who were born in Israel, but also Israeli conservative Jews and Reform Jews who still do not enjoy the equality, not in funds, not in rights, not in recognition in front of the state. What needs to happen in Israel is separation between state and the politics of religion. Israel is captive in the hands of a minority that has a hold of what it means to be Jewish. That is wrong. It was never the way of Judaism, never. It was always pluralist, it was always polyphonic, and the fact that this does not have this polyphonic voice, this pluralist Judaism does not exist in Israel today is close to being a tragedy. This is something that Israel needs to fix because of Israel. And secondly, because of its very, very, very important relationship with diaspora Jews.
Thank you very much.
It's more or less.
It's perfect. Thank you very much. And now for our third speaker, member of Knesset Michal Cotler-Wunsh, also from the Blue and White Party, who was elected to the Knesset this year. MK Cotler-Wunsh spent many of her formative years in Canada and is the daughter of someone familiar to many of you, Canada's former Minister of Justice, Irwin Cotler. She has fast become one of the most outspoken MKs on the importance of strengthening Israel's relationship with global Jewry. And I know we're all eager to hear her thoughts on today's topic. MK Cotler-Wunsh, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity of engaging in this very important conversation. I guess from my own particular story, having grown up in Montreal and then emigrated with four Canadian kids to Israel, I'm very familiar with the importance and the imperative for this engagement. And, you know, I think at the end of the day, if I had to sort of respond or reflect on both what Tehila said and what Merav said, I think the most important part to me and the reasoning behind forming and launching the subcommittee on Israel diaspora relations is the imperative for engagement. So for me, the question is not if. Of course, yes, engagement. For me, the question, and I think maybe that's what we should be, sort of focusing on, is how engagement, and what is important that we address in this engagement, and what is important that we take into account. And I think that we're living, first of all, at a historic moment where we have a tremendous opportunity alongside the challenges to reshape, to reframe, perhaps to flip the paradigm in Israel diaspora relations in the way that it was set out to be, with Israel as the organizing project that we all gathered around. The state of Israel exists. It has existed for 72 years. And my question would be for us to reflect on is, how do we renew that covenant? And how do we, and in many ways, what do we want to be discussing in that engagement? I'll say that one of my first bills proposed in the Knesset as a private MK is actually the Declaration of Independence as a basic law. So to me, part of the answer in how we engage and in what we engage is actually, I would say, the foundational document, the Declaration of Independence, which affirms our being the state, the Jewish and democratic state of Israel, returned to our ancestral homeland with everything that that means, Jewish and democratic. And I think that we've reached not only the opportunity, but the imperative to discuss what that and means and what that and looks like, and to have that conversation together, Israel and diaspora. What does that mean, Israel as a Jewish and democratic state? And how do we renew the covenant to the Declaration of Independence together? As I said, I think that really moving forward, and that is the imperative or at least the mission statement of the Subcommittee on Israel Diaspora Relations, is to engage. And I do want to refer a little bit to the challenges of doing so in law. And I say this as a lawyer. Sometimes a law actually dilutes or at least sets like a minimum RAF, which becomes the maximum RAF for engagement. And I think that we, for many, many years, have sort of averted or avoided having the deep level conversations in which reciprocity has to really come into play. And by that, I mean, especially at a time of, as we know, the challenges of intersectionality and identity politics. In many ways, Israel is also the solution, or the reaffirmation of Israel as the Jewish and democratic state is also the solution for renewing the sense of identity for Jewry throughout the world. And so I maybe relate a little bit to what Merav said with regards to who is it exactly that is the one single voice or the 10 single voices or whatever this mechanism will look like. And I think that the way to broach this would be also through engagement. So we have, the organizations and we, of course, the Jewish Agency and so forth. We have them and they exist for many of these conversations to take place. Within Knesset, to me, what's most important is that Knesset members, we ourselves, take into account the multiplicity of voices, the pluralism of voices as we sit around the decision-making table, that we are aware of the multiplicity of voices, all of them, not only certain ones, as we sit around the decision-making tables, and that diaspora Jews all over. And I say this and I stress this because I don't only look at North America as the Jews we should be engaging with. Diaspora Jews also keep in mind what are Israel's challenges in that reciprocity, in that paradigm shift, if you will, of what this relationship looks like in the next 70 years. Assuming that in many ways, we have Olim in the state of Israel from all over the world, and they represent a real live bridge. And I would say, and I say this often, including recently in Knesset, the voices of Olim and the viewpoint diversity that they offer hasn't actually trickled up, when you think about it, to the public political realm in the way that it should. When you look at Israel's economy and business sector and philanthropic sector and educational sector, you see the impact of Olim from all over the world. And yet, when you look at the public and political sector, it's interesting to note that we haven't actually managed to trickle up and to create that part of where we are the live bridges, and I include myself in that live bridge, where we are the live bridges that bring the communities into Knesset or into the political, decision-making realm and table. I think that in that sense, this conversation is, first of all, so important. I'm grateful to the declaration, to the declaratory piece of where Eric began the conversation. Of course, the answer is yes. Of course, we have to create this consultation process. And then I ask us how. And to reflect on the how, I think that even that has to be an engaged process that we come up with together so that it's about us, not without us. Diaspora Jewry should not once again be told how it is that we should be collaborating or engaging, but rather through that engagement, we may create other infrastructures. And by that engagement, we would definitely be deepening the relationships and become more aware of the challenges throughout, both in Israel and diaspora. I hope that that's sufficient for now, and I'd be delighted to engage further.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Wow, that has been three incredible perspectives, and I think this is exactly what we needed to hear. So now I'm going to ask some questions that we have for the members of Knesset and for Eric. Please jump in to answer any of these questions. I would only ask that you try to keep your answers brief so that we can get the engagement from the entirety of our panel to as many questions as possible. So let's start with an issue that sort of was part of what Eric was talking about, the issue of taxation without representation, if you will. Should people who don't live with the consequences of the decisions that are made have a voice or a vote or an involvement in making those decisions? Or are there certain topics that should be left entirely to Israeli citizens, and how do you separate those things out? So please, any one of our panel members are welcome to begin. Again, please keep your answers to about a minute and a half.
I can start because I already touched on that. I think it's obvious that it's only certain issues. But in those certain issues, I think the entire Jewish people live with the circumstances. I mean, with the outcomes. And that's how I define them. Now, how would we do it legally? That's a great challenge. But the Kotel is not more mine than yours. I live in Jerusalem. I'm Jerusalemite. We tend to think that we own Jerusalem, but we know we don't. I mean, we kind of hold it for everybody. So I don't see why, really. I don't think I need to have a more of a voice when it comes to, the one place that should be the center of the entire Jewish people. And it's true also for the question of who's a Jew. When it comes to immigration, and, because in Israel there is no separation, so it's more complicated. But the question of who's a Jew, you remember David Ben-Gurion asking 50 scholars, Jewish scholars. He didn't ask 50 Israeli scholars. He asked 50 Jewish scholars. It's a question of us all.
Okay. Anybody else want to add anything to this particular question?
Maybe I'll jump in, David. So, the question is, for me, how you define the issues, because at the end of the day, we may think, and we changes all the time, that certain issues don't affect life in diaspora. I would say when there's a war in Israel, and I say this knowing what happens on campuses, for example, when there's a war in Israel, it very much affects diaspora Jewry. And so we, saying there are some issues that are more impactful than others is going to be a very difficult conversation. The one thing I'll say about that is the very engagement in the conversation of what are the issues would definitely deepen the relationship. And the one more thing I would add with regards to, Ben-Gurion's reaching out to, who is a Jew. There's something that we didn't address. And I think it's sort of the elephant in the room. And maybe the engagement would involve discussing that as well. And that is, there was a covenant, it was unstated. It was sort of an unwritten document. We create a state and you all come, you being diaspora Jewry, my parents included. And that didn't work out, right? We created a state, whoever was here, whoever we was in that engagement. But it didn't quite work out that way. And we're living with that dichotomy that I think we haven't actually resolved fully yet. What does that mean 4 generations later? What does that mean 5 generations later? And how do we create that engagement really deeply on affirming that on one hand, the Jewish and democratic state of Israel encourages Aliyah because that's its mission, vision, and values, to be the Jewish homeland of the Jewish people. And at the same time, it doesn't only engage with those that make Aliyah, but continues to be an anchor and a live bridge to communities all over the world that remain in the countries that they are in. I think that these are, the more sort of challenging issues that we still have to engage in. And I think that, as I said, that very engagement is what has the prospect of making us closer and really speaking in a way that is fully respectful and understanding of the very different points of view in terms of what has happened and evolved over time and where we are today.
Thank you.
David, with your permission, I'm listening and I'm thinking, let's talk about issues. And if we want to mention an elephant in the room, I mean, there are plenty, I think, of elephants parked here, one next to another in various colors. Let's talk about settlements, for instance. Should settlements be an issue in which diaspora Jews have a say in Israel? Because I think had we held a vote among American Jews, I think they would vote against the settlements and for an agreement with our neighbors, the Palestinians. So I think, and what we're actually seeing is that, as I said, those who take the bother to influence what's happening in Israel are actually mostly investing in more and more settlements, widening the settlements, deepening the settlements, etc. Moreover, unfortunately, it's very clear, again, the non-spoken agenda of, but then again, not here, but regularly very much spoken agenda, and the right one of diaspora Jews of non-recognition in their identity as Jews, regardless whether they are pure whatever Jews, but not Orthodox enough, or if they're not, from the right grandfather or grandmother. At the same time, the majority of those who do make it their business to put a lot of money into influencing the decisions made in Israel are mostly leading to strengthening the Orthodox or sometimes ultra-Orthodox foundations in Israel and in Israeli politics. So again, when we talk about this kind of engagement, what is it exactly that we talk about? I think we need to keep in mind that we're not starting from zero. It's not like nothing is happening. It's not like there are no American or diaspora Jews who are already involved. So maybe there is a possibility that what you're asking is actually, maybe you want to even dilute this kind of intervention that is already taking place.
So I think that point is a really interesting perspective and an important one, and it sort of begs another question, which is, should every Jew around the world have a say in what happens in Israel? In other words, what about those who have no connection to the state of Israel, or even those who promote anti-Israel sentiments? Should they have the same kind of voice as the most supportive? You've put in perspective here the issue of contributions to Israel, emotional and financial, and its impact on certain aspects of the Israeli society and its structure. And the question is, open it up a little broader and say, what about those Jews who aren't supportive of the state of Israel? Should they have a voice the same way as those who are?
No, but David, if
not to everyone.
Okay, so if I may, then define support of Israel. If a person believes that the two-state solution should be implemented ASAP, does that count for supporting Israel or not supporting Israel? Who gets to say and to define what counts for support of Israel? So we are getting into a more and more complicated definition area, I would say, because what I would consider to be support of Israel, maybe someone else, calls it a whole different ballgame. Now, we're not saying, of course, we're not talking about those who say Israel should not exist. Okay, I think that would be clear. But again, your question is correct. Even if we talk about this kind of extreme end, if a person is considered to be a Jew, do they not have this kind of right for a voice? And what does it mean, this right for a voice? Again, I'm going back to stating, or you know what, I'll say it in the end.
Okay, I just want to observe, it's remarkable to me that on a panel with 3 members of Knesset, somehow the discussion morphs into political discussion. That's amazing, but that's actually what we need to hear. So if others would like to comment, I would welcome that as well.
So you can't avoid the political.
But David, maybe I'll piggyback off of what you just said, and I would like to comment on that actually, because I think that part of the process we've seen, and certainly, we're not starting the conversation anew, it's a conversation that's continuing, is the politicization and the personalization of the state of Israel, and it becoming, partisan issue, a wedge issue, if you will, and as we sort of hear in the background, diaspora Jewry becoming a wedge issue, and a partisan issue, possibly in Israel as well. And I think that that's something we need to give our attention to. I think that that is probably one of the greatest challenges that we currently face, the State of Israel and diaspora Jewry's relationship becoming a wedge issue in each other's reality. And if I may, it's a little bit of where I began. The Jewish Peoplehood Joint Project was the State of Israel. You know, we all had the little blue boxes and we all created what we thought was a united, one sense of our united project. We gathered around it. And I believe that in order to continue this conversation deeply and meaningfully, we do have to create some sort of an understanding or an anchoring of the vision, the mission, and the values that we can gather around. So I suggested, as I said, the Declaration of Independence, the State of Israel as Jewish and democratic. By the way, not just as Jewish and not just as democratic. And those are the values that emanate from what that means. And that discussion is the one that I believe we can be engaging in order to lead the way forward. I have to say that without that, you know, and I think that this panel is actually an indication of that. We're sort of drawing at straws. We don't even have a common basis around which we can gather. And when I say renewing the covenant or reaffirming that understanding for Jewish peoplehood, I think that that is the imperative for the discussion we should be holding.
MK Friedman.
Yeah, so two short remarks. First, I fully agree with Merav that we're not starting from zero. And there are Jews who have significant influence in Israel. And I just don't think it should be only money-based. And in a way, I want to open it. I want to give more voices a place. Second, I just don't see what's so frightening about giving people a voice, not a say, a voice. And this is different. When you say someone has a say, it's like, you know, he votes or he has, you have to take him in you have to, I don't know, it's not like you have to agree, but you have to count him. And when I think about listening to someone's voice, it's opening your perspective, is understanding, you know, broadening your understanding. It's not like you become the same, you know, you weight the same as the citizens. No, it's like in companies. So I always think in companies, you have the people who are shareholders and people who are optional holders. I'm not sure I'm translating it true. Is that optional? Is that correct?
We get the idea.
Okay, so we the citizens, we are the shareholders, but you are optional holders because you can become a shareholder and holders whenever you want. So also from, you know, a legal perspective in companies, you count in a way the optional holders, not the same way you count the shareholders. So, and I'm not so, I don't know, I was born here, I'm a Sabra. And I'm not afraid of it. I don't see what damage can be.
Okay.
You know, what's the damage? What's the risk?
Eric, did you have something you wanted to add?
I just, this is such a fascinating conversation, and I love listening to all three of the members of Knesset. I want to say something that Michal Cotler-Wunsh said 2 answers ago. I want to bring back, and that is that the listening to diverse opinions and listening to all possible stakeholders and all those who are affected only strengthens the legislative process. You know, I had the privilege of being a member of the Ohio State Legislature and a member of the United States House of Representatives. Both, you know, Ohio's a very diverse state, right? From our industrial to our rural to our north to our south. And part of what I just loved about it was the opportunity, as you know, Hillel also said, I quoted Hillel before, Hillel also said to not judge someone until you've stood in their shoes, right? To really understand the impact of what we're talking about on different parts of who we are. Israel is such a diverse society. When I was at a tekes of my nephew who became a paratrooper. And I was in tears, not only because he's my nephew and he grew up in my home, but because the diversity of, the colors and the languages and of where people came from. And so the more that you can, I want you as members of Knesset to hear the diversity of Jewish voices, and of course, not those that are just the loudest, either by virtue of they're the most organized or they have status as a donor, but all voices. And I want you to take that into account in your wisdom as you make decisions. And I think the conversation we're having is about just simply how do we organize that in a way that that really benefits it. It's hard for me to see why that wouldn't strengthen and benefit Israel democracy.
What is the population in Israel's reaction to those very questions about the nature of the involvement that we in the diaspora should have in their lives?
Unfortunately, I think if it was Israelis, so the vast majority would say no, they should not have more influence than they have today. But the good news is that we used to be a very small bubble of people who really were aware and cared enough. And this bubble is getting bigger. And a lot of it has to do with all those missions of reverse birthright, of influential Israelis who get to know the communities. And once they get to know, they get to care. And it has to do with a very poor Israeli education about the Jewish people, temporary Jewish people. So it needs to be changed. And maybe I need to wait with my proposal till it change. And maybe not. It depends. Because this is a conversation I was hoping to have. Because I see legislation as a process, and this conversation is part of this process.
MK Michaeli, how about you? What do you think about that? How would your constituents answer the questions?
First of all, I think it's important that you understand, that people understand that most Israelis really have a very, very, very scarce idea about diaspora Jews, a very scarce idea. They're completely absent from their day-to-day experience, education, media, whatever. They don't see those communities. They don't know about them. I think largely, I think it's a mutual ignorance. The vast majority of diaspora Jews do not know Israeli reality that well. And that is very understandable. After all, people are living their own lives. They're not consumed with, even if you have a brother or a sister who live far away relatively. And Israel, keep in mind that in Israel, it's not unlike in the States that you grow up and then you go to live on the other coast. In Israel, it's very common that people live very close to one another. Families are everything's very intimate, very familiar. And so people are consumed with that. And really, they have a very little idea of what diaspora Jewry is about. So I think it's not that they would be against it so much, it's that the idea would be weird for them. But having said that, I think it's so it doesn't stem from like any kind of objection. But as I said, a big lack of consciousness about this whole phenomenon and this whole world of Jews living elsewhere. I do have to say, though, that there is generally speaking, huge support among Israeli public for the pluralistic rights of all kinds of Jews. There is a lot of anger about the monopolizing of the Western Wall, of marriage and divorce, of even conversion, which is something that is less relevant for most Israelis. There's a lot of anger about the cruel and unjust monopolization that was done to those issues. And there's huge support among the general public in Israel for treating all Jews equally as people should be treated.
MK Cotler-Wunsh, do you want to add something to that, or do you want to just roll?
No, I have to I'll say very briefly. I just wanted to say that actually, precisely, I think both Tehila and Merav captured it so well. And I think that the most important, and actually what brought me to Knesset, and a big part of what I feel my mission is in Knesset, is to create the understanding of this mutual ignorance, if you will, that we may have of each other, that we do have of each other, that they both refer to, diaspora in Israel. It is precisely the point of creating the subcommittee on Israel-diaspora relations and bringing in those voices to engage. And I just want to say, I think it's also the challenge of our generation. And it's a huge challenge. And that is, do we opt in when we have the choice to create this relationship? So Jewish peoplehood was actually cast upon us from outside threats, generally speaking. And here we are living in this incredible time in history where we have to opt in. There is no one forcing us to create that sense of Jewish peoplehood. We need to create the parameters around which we positively engage with the concept of Jewish peoplehood and Jewish continuity. And herein lies the tremendous, I'd say, both opportunity and responsibility of our generation.
I'd like to invite each of you to, with closing remarks.
Closing remarks. It's interesting. I want to say something opposite to the last thing I said. I said that the vast majority of Israelis don't know and don't care enough. And yet, I think it's one of the issues that we can create unity around. I think that the Jewish identity is so deep for Israelis, and Jewish solidarity is still deep. And I think somehow we need to open people's eyes for the existence of, more than half of the Jewish people outside of Israel. And I'm sure, I'm definitely sure that it's a matter of time. I think the gap and the rift can be right up again.
Many people that I know in America feel alienated and feel angry at the attitude they're receiving in the state of Israel, from the state of Israel, either directly or non-directly. And I'm as always, very, very worried about that. I think the relationship between Israel and diaspora Jews is extremely important, and it should not rely on, do we find a mechanism to have those voices heard this way or another. It's the obligation of the state of Israel to actually be the homeland for all of the Jewish people, and to act as such, to legislate itself as such, to have genuine, deep recognition of Judaism as it is today, not only according to the stronger political, religious voices in Israel. As I said in the beginning, I will say it again, I think this is something Israel owes itself, regardless of demands or whatever from diaspora Jews. And it's something that I've been fighting for many years and will not let go until it happens. That's for sure. Now, one thing that you were planning on touching upon, but we never got to, is the obligations of Israel generally towards diaspora Jews. And I have to tell you that I think it was Eric who said, of course, if there was ever a community in danger, there's no government will abandon a community in need anywhere. I'm sure that is true. But at the same time, what we've been seeing, unfortunately, from our last governments is looking the other way across from phenomenons of anti-Semitism in all kinds of places in the world for whatever gains or political or other kinds of gains that seemed more worthy at the time. Something I find very, very troubling and think that should not happen in Israel. And another another example I want to give is something, again, that my government does, unfortunately, and that is kind of abandoning the part of the Jewish community in America that does not subscribe to the sitting president. And unfortunately, my government identifies with the current president in a way that certainly alienates part of the community, and some would even argue maybe puts them in some kind of jeopardize, unfortunately. So again, this is something that I think any government in Israel should pay attention not to do, and not to put anyone in this position.
It is certainly the case that the Israeli public does not know enough about diaspora Judaism. Those who've come and lived with us as shlichim or because of family or because of business have a much better appreciation of the diversity of Jewish life, to the point that MK Cotler-Wunsh made. All Jews are Jews of choice today. This has been true in the diaspora for many, many years, right? We don't live in comprehensively Jewish communities under Jewish calendar, and so we have to have developed ways of building and strengthening identity that I think Israelis could learn more about. But the same thing is, we have much more to learn about today's Israeli culture. For too many of us, our minds are still back on the pictures of 67 or 73 or even 48. And today's Israeli society is dynamic and culturally vibrant and diverse, as we've discussed before, and it's created its own Israeli culture, which we need to understand and appreciate and know more about. So I agree with that point completely. It's our job as leaders, I hope the leaders of the Knesset and of the government of Israel, and it's our jobs as leaders of the Jewish communities in North America to make sure that we never let our hearts turn to stone towards each other, that we always build this dialogue. I'm so excited that we have leaders in Israel who are pushing that conversation forward, and to MK Friedman and Michaeli and Cotler-Wunsh, I promise you that on our side of the ocean, we will push that conversation forward as well.
Face to face.
Amen.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.